What would you do if a little girl walked into a courtroom, a wild lynx by her side staring down the law itself? On a snowy March morning in Grayson County, 10-year-old Emma Harper did just that. Her voice trembling, her heart breaking, fighting for the only family she had left. Was it madness or something deeper? Something that could rewrite everything we know about the wild? Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 supporters. Don't miss how this shocking story unfolds. The Grayson County Courthouse stood like a weathered sentinel against the biting chill of a late March morning in 2025. Snowflakes drifted lazily outside, dusting the frostbitten pines that framed the old brick building. Inside, the air buzzed with a low hum of anticipation. Folks in heavy coats shuffled in their seats, their whispers weaving a tapestry of curiosity and disbelief. This wasn't just another small-town case about land disputes or petty theft. No, today was different. Today, the impossible was about to walk through those heavy oak doors. The clock struck 9 and the room fell silent as the bailiff's voice cut through the tension. "All rise for the Honorable Margaret Cole." A tall woman with silver-streaked hair strode to the bench, her black robe swaying like a shadow. She adjusted her glasses, peering over the rim at the packed gallery. "Be seated," she said, her tone sharp as the winter wind. "Let's get this over with." Before anyone could settle, the doors creaked open and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. There she was. Emma Harper, all of 10 years old, stepping into the courtroom with the quiet confidence of someone twice her age. Her blonde hair hung in a tangled braid, peeking out from the hood of her father's faded green jacket, too big for her small frame. Her gray eyes sparkled with a fierce determination that made you forget she was just a kid. But it wasn't Emma who stole the breath from every soul in that room. It was what walked beside her. Riley padded in, his silver-gray fur catching the dim light filtering through the tall windows. A lynx. Wild, untamed, and yet eerily calm, moved with a grace that belied his nature. No leash, no collar, just the soft click of his claws against the polished wood floor. He stayed close to Emma, his amber eyes scanning the room before settling back on her, as if she were his anchor in this sea of strangers. "What in God's name is this?" Judge Cole's voice boomed, her gavel slamming down like a thunderclap. "This is a courtroom, not a zoo. Remove that animal at once." Emma didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders, her small hands curling into fists. "Please, ma'am," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "His name's Riley. He's with me. He won't hurt anyone, I promise." The judge's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, a man in a stiff gray suit stood up from the front row. Henry Brooks, head of the Wildlife Commission, cleared his throat with the kind of authority that made people sit straighter. "Your Honor, this is precisely the problem," he said, his words clipped and cold. "That lynx is a danger to this community. It belongs in a preserve, not parading around with a child. We're here to enforce the law, not indulge in fairy tales." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Emma's gaze darted to Brooks, then back to the judge. "Riley's not a danger," she said, louder this time. "He's family. My dad saved him, and I've taken care of him ever since. You can't take him away from me." Judge Cole leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Young lady, the law doesn't bend for sentiment. You've got 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't have that animal hauled out of here right now, and you'd better make it good." Emma swallowed hard, her fingers brushing against Riley's fur for courage. She could feel his warmth, steady and familiar, like the memory of her father's hand on her shoulder. "Okay," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "I'll tell you everything. It started 2 years ago," she began, her voice carrying a quiet strength that hushed the room. Her dad, Jack Harper, wasn't just a farmer, he was a man who listened to the land. When the river flooded their valley, he'd waded into the churning water to pull Riley out, a shivering lynx kitten tangled in debris. Jack brought him home, built a pen behind the barn, and taught Emma how to care for him. "He's not a pet," Jack would say, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "He's a wild thing that chose us. You respect that, Emma. You listen to him." Those lessons stuck with her, even after the night Jack didn't come home. A storm had torn through Grayson, and he'd climbed up to fix the barn roof. The wind took him before anyone could stop it. Emma was left with her Aunt Ellen, a kind woman with tired eyes, and Riley, the last piece of her dad she could hold on to. Now the Wildlife Commission wanted to rip that away too. Henry Brooks stood there with his clipboard and his rules, saying Riley didn't belong with her, that he was too wild, too unpredictable, but Emma knew better. She'd seen Riley curl up by the fireplace on cold nights, his purr a soft hum against the crackling logs. She'd watched him wait for her at the edge of the woods every afternoon, like he knew she'd come back from school. He wasn't just some animal. He was her family. The room stayed quiet as she finished, her voice breaking just a little on that last word. Judge Cole tapped her pen against the desk, her stern face softening for a fleeting moment. "That's a fine story, Miss Harper," she said, "but laws aren't built on feelings, they're built on facts. Mr. Brooks, your turn." Brooks straightened his tie, a smug edge to his smile. "The facts are simple, Your Honor. Lynxes don't belong in homes. They're predators, not playmates. This girl's lucky she hasn't been hurt, or worse." Emma's heart sank, but she didn't look away. Riley pressed closer, his tail flicking once, as if he understood every word. She reached down, resting her hand on his head. "We'll prove it," she whispered to him. "Like Dad always said, we'll show them what we're made of." Judge Cole sighed, glancing from Emma to Brooks and back again. "I'll hear both sides," she said finally. "But I'm warning you, young lady, this better be more than a tall tale. Court's in recess for 10 minutes. We'll see if you've got anything else up your sleeve." As the gavel fell, Emma took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on her small shoulders. She didn't know how, but she'd fight for Riley, for her dad, for the promise she'd made to keep them together, no matter what. 2 years ago, the Grayson Valley wasn't the quiet stretch of snow-dusted fields it was now. Back then, the river had teeth. It roared through the land like a living thing, swollen from days of rain that wouldn't quit. Emma remembered the sound of it, the way it growled against the banks, tearing at the roots of the old pines her dad loved so much. She was 8 then, small enough to still fit in the crook of Jack Harper's arm as he stood on the porch, watching the water rise. "Stay inside, Emma," he'd said that morning, his voice rough but warm, like the wool blanket he'd tucked around her shoulders. "I'll be back before you know it." She'd watched him pull on his boots, the ones with the cracked soles he never bothered to replace, and head out into the storm. That was Jack. Always moving, always fixing something, always listening to the world in a way Emma was only starting to understand. He didn't come back empty-handed. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time she heard his truck rumble up the drive. Emma ran to the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass. There he was, soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and in his arms, cradled like something precious, was a tiny bundle of wet fur, gray and shivering with ears too big for its head. A lynx kitten barely bigger than a barn cat, its eyes still cloudy with the haze of a newborn. "Found him caught in some branches down by the river," Jack said as he kicked the door shut behind him. "Poor thing was half drowned, couldn't leave him there." He set the kitten down on an old towel by the fireplace, and Emma knelt beside it, her breath catching at how fragile it looked. "What's his name, Dad?" she asked, already reaching out a tentative hand. Jack chuckled, the sound low and steady. "That's up to you, kiddo. He's your responsibility now, too." She thought for a moment, watching the kitten twitch its tail. Riley, she decided. He looks like a Riley. From that day, Riley became part of the Harper farm. Jack built a pen out back, just past the barn where the chickens clucked and the wind whistled through the gaps in the wood. It wasn't a cage. Jack hated cages. "Wild things need room to breathe," he'd say, hammering the last nail into place. But Riley didn't stay in the pen much. He'd follow Emma around the yard, his little legs wobbling at first, then growing stronger with every passing week. By the time summer rolled around, he was leaping onto the porch railing, watching her with those sharp amber eyes that seemed to see right through her. Jack taught her how to read him. "Look at his ears," he'd say, pointing as Riley flicked them back. "That means he's listening. And when his tail's still like that, he's calm. You gotta know what he's saying without words, Em. That's how you trust each other." They'd sit together in the evenings, the three of them, Jack whittling a piece of cedar, Emma cross-legged on the grass, and Riley sprawled out like he owned the place. Sometimes Jack would hum an old folk tune, one he said his grandpa sang to the horses. Riley's ears would perk up and he'd settle closer, his purr rumbling soft as a summer brook. Those nights felt endless, like the valley itself was holding its breath to keep them safe. But nothing lasts forever. Not the warm evenings, not the sound of Jack's voice. It was the storm that took him, not the river this time, but the wind. A late fall gale ripped through Grayson, howling like it had a score to settle. The barn roof had been leaking for weeks, and Jack wouldn't let it go another day. "Can't have the hay rotting," he'd said, kissing Emma's forehead before climbing the ladder. She'd watched from the kitchen window, her hands tight around a mug of cocoa Aunt Ellen had made. The crack came sudden and sharp, like a bone snapping. The ladder buckled and Jack fell. Too fast for her to scream, too fast for anyone to catch him. When Ellen pulled her away from the window, Emma's world went quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down until you can't breathe. He was gone, just like that, leaving behind a half-finished pen, a pair of worn boots by the door, and Riley. Aunt Ellen moved in after that, her soft hands and softer words trying to fill the empty spaces. She was Jack's older sister, with the same gray eyes and stubborn streak, but none of his wildness. "I don't know about that lynx, Emma," she'd say, watching Riley pace the yard. "He's not like us." But she didn't fight it. Not when she saw how Emma lit up around him, how Riley waited by the gate every afternoon like he was keeping a promise. Back in the courtroom, Emma's voice trembled as she finished the story. The crowd was still, their breaths held like they could see it all, the river, the firelight, Jack's steady hands. She looked up at Judge Cole, her small frame dwarfed by the towering bench. "Dad didn't just save Riley," she said, her words catching in her throat. "He saved me too, and now they want to take him away like he's nothing. But he's everything." Henry Brooks shifted in his seat, his lips thinning into a hard line. "Touching," he said, his voice dripping with ice. "But a lynx isn't a teddy bear, Your Honor. It's a wild animal, and no amount of bedtime stories changes that." Judge Cole didn't respond right away. She leaned back, her fingers steepled under her chin, studying Emma like she was a puzzle missing a piece. The silence stretched, heavy and thick, until she finally spoke. "We'll see about that, Mr. Brooks. Let's take a break. I need some air, and I suspect we all do." As the gavel fell, Emma sank onto the bench beside Riley, her hand resting on his neck. His fur was warm, grounding her against the storm brewing inside. She didn't know what came next, but she'd fight. For Jack, for Riley, for the family they'd built, one quiet night at a time. The courtroom doors swung shut behind them, and the chill of the March afternoon hit Emma like a slap. She pulled her dad's old jacket tighter around her, the worn fabric brushing her chin as she stepped into the parking lot. Riley stayed close, his silver fur ruffled by the wind, his ears twitching at the crunch of snow underfoot. The crowd spilled out after them, lawyers in stiff coats, townsfolk bundled in scarves, all buzzing with whispers about the little girl and her lynx. Judge Cole had called a recess, and the air felt thick with something unspoken, like the calm before a storm. Emma found a spot near the edge of the lot where the pavement gave way to a line of skeletal trees. She sank onto a low bench, Riley settling beside her with a soft huff. "We're doing okay, right?" she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. He tilted his head, those amber eyes locking onto hers, steady and sure. It was the same look he'd given her after Jack's funeral, when she'd sat by his pen for hours, too numb to cry. Riley didn't need words to tell her he was there. Aunt Ellen caught up, her boots crunching against the icy gravel. "You did good in there, Em," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Your dad would have been proud." She hesitated, glancing at Riley. "Just be careful, okay? These folks don't see what we do." Emma nodded, but before she could answer, a sharp cry cut through the chatter. Heads turned and the crowd parted like a wave. Something was moving near the far end of the lot. A dark shape stumbling between the parked trucks, low to the ground and unsteady. A woman shrieked, clutching her purse. "It's a bear!" someone yelled, and panic rippled outward. Emma stood, her heart thudding as she squinted through the swirling snow. It wasn't a full-grown grizzly, but a young black bear, smaller than Riley, its fur matted with blood and dirt. One of its front legs dragged limp, and its breath came in ragged snarls. It must have wandered down from the hills, maybe hit by a car or caught in a trap. Now it was here, cornered and scared, its wild eyes darting as people backed away. Henry Brooks pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with indignation. "See, this is what I'm talking about," he barked, jabbing a finger toward the bear. "Wild animals don't belong here. Someone call the rangers, now." A few folks fumbled for their phones, their voices rising in a frantic hum. But Emma didn't move. She watched the bear, her breath fogging in the cold air. Its growls weren't angry. They were desperate, like Riley's had been that day by the river. She could feel it, the same pull she'd felt with him. "Wait," she said, stepping forward before Ellen could grab her arm. "Let me try." "Emma, no." Ellen's voice cracked, but Emma was already moving, her small frame cutting through the chaos. Riley stayed at her side, his tail low but steady, like he knew what she was about to do. The crowd hushed, their fear giving way to something else. Curiosity, maybe? Or disbelief? The bear reared up, a clumsy half-stance on its good leg, its teeth bared in a warning snarl. Emma stopped a few yards away, close enough to see the blood streaking its fur, far enough to give it space. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay." "You're hurt, huh? I get it." Brooks snorted, crossing his arms. "She's lost her mind. That thing'll tear her apart." But Judge Cole, standing near the courthouse steps, said nothing, her sharp eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. Emma took a slow breath, her hands trembling but steady as she raised them, palms out. She started to hum, the old folk tune Jack used to sing, the one Riley loved. The notes were shaky at first, then stronger, weaving through the wind like a thread pulling tight. "Come all you fair and tender maids," she sang, her voice small but clear, "who flourish in your prime." The bear's ears flicked, its head tilting just a fraction, its growls softened, fading into a low, uncertain rumble. Emma kept singing, stepping closer, one careful foot at a time. Riley moved with her, silent as a shadow, his presence a quiet shield. The bear's eyes met hers, wild and wary, but the fight was draining out of it. It sank down, its injured leg folding under, and let out a long, shuddering breath. The crowd stood frozen, their gasps swallowed by the stillness. Emma knelt a few feet away, her song trailing off into the cold. "You're safe now," she whispered. "We'll get you help." The bear didn't move, just watched her, its chest rising and falling like it trusted her to keep that promise. Ellen rushed forward, her face pale. "Emma Harper, you scared me half to death," she hissed, but her eyes shone with something like awe. The crowd erupted then, some clapping, others murmuring in hushed tones. A man in a plaid coat shook his head. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered. Brooks stormed over, his voice cutting through the noise. "This proves my point," he snapped, glaring at Judge Cole. "She's reckless, putting herself and everyone else in danger. That bear should have been shot, not sung to." Judge Cole stepped down from the steps, her boots crunching in the snow. "Enough, Mr. Brooks," she said, her tone icy but calm. "I saw what I saw. A child just did what none of us could. We're going back inside. I want everyone in their seats in 5 minutes." As the crowd shuffled toward the courthouse, Emma stayed where she was, her hand resting on Riley's head. The bear was still there, quiet now, its eyes locked on her like she'd spoken a language it understood. "Dad was right," she whispered to Riley. "They don't get it yet, but they will." Ellen knelt beside her, pulling her into a quick, fierce hug. "You're too much like him, you know that," she said, her voice thick. Emma smiled, just a little, and stood as the rangers arrived to tend to the bear. She didn't know what the judge would decide, but something had shifted. She could feel it, sharp and bright, like the first crack of dawn after a long night. The courthouse doors thudded shut, sealing out the biting wind and the murmurs of the crowd still lingering in the parking lot. Inside, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had just happened. Emma sat at the front, her small hands folded in her lap, Riley stretched out beside her like a silver-gray sentinel. His tail flicked once, brushing her leg, and she drew a quiet strength from that touch. The room buzzed with restless energy, whispers, coughs, the creak of old benches, but her eyes stayed fixed on Judge Cole's empty chair. This was it, the last chance to make them see. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" Judge Cole swept back in, her robe billowing as she took her seat. Her face was a mask of stern lines, but there was something new in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even doubt. She adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "Let's finish this," she said, her tone clipped but steady. "Mr. Brooks, you're up." Henry Brooks stood, smoothing his tie with a practiced hand. He carried himself like a man who'd already won, his shoulders squared and his voice booming with cold certainty. "Your Honor, what we saw out there wasn't proof of anything noble. It was reckless endangerment. That bear could have mauled her or anyone else in that lot. And this lynx," he gestured at Riley, his lip curling, "it's no different. A predator doesn't change its nature because a child sings it a lullaby. The law is clear. Wild animals belong in the wild, not in our homes. This girl's lucky she's still in one piece, but luck isn't a legal defense." The crowd shifted, some nodding, others frowning. Brooks paced a few steps, his words sharp as shards of ice. "Jack Harper might have been a good man, but he made a mistake bringing that lynx into his daughter's life, and now she's clinging to it like a security blanket, putting herself and this community at risk. The Wildlife Commission demands Riley be removed to a preserve today. Anything less is a failure of justice." He sat down, folding his arms with a smug nod. Judge Cole tapped her pen against the desk, her gaze sliding to Emma. "Ms. Harper," she said, her voice softer now, "you've got the floor. Make it count." Emma stood, her legs wobbling just a little under the weight of every eye in the room. She brushed a strand of blonde hair from her face and took a deep breath, the kind that steadies a racing heart. "Mr. Brooks is right about one thing," she began, her voice small but clear. "Riley's wild, I know that. Dad knew that too. But he didn't save Riley to lock him up somewhere. He saved him because he believed some things, some bonds, go deeper than rules on paper." She glanced at Riley, his amber eyes meeting hers like they always did. "Dad taught me how to listen to him," she said. "When his ears go back, he's curious. When he purrs, he's happy. Every night he sleeps by the door waiting for me to come home. He doesn't hurt anyone. Not me, not Aunt Ellen, not even the chickens half the time." A few people chuckled, and the tension eased, just a fraction. "But it's more than that," she went on, her voice growing stronger. "Out there with the bear, I wasn't trying to be brave or stupid. I felt it. Like I felt Riley that first day. Dad always said the wild isn't something to fight, it's something to understand. And Riley's my family. He's all I've got left of Dad. If you take him away, it's like losing him all over again." Her throat tightened, and she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Aunt Ellen stood beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "She's not making this up, Your Honor," Ellen said. her voice steady but thick with emotion. "I've seen it myself. That lynx doesn't act like any wild animal I've ever known. He waits for her. He trusts her. Jack raised them both that way, and I'll be damned if I let anyone say it's wrong." The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that presses in and holds you still. Judge Cole leaned back, her pen stilled, but before she could speak, a new voice broke the hush. A woman in a tan coat stepped forward from the gallery, tall, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun. "If I may, Your Honor," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I'm Dr. Laura Evans, a wildlife biologist from Grayson College. I've been watching this case and I'd like to offer some perspective." Judge Cole raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go ahead, Dr. Evans." Laura clasped her hands, her eyes sweeping the room. "I've studied lynxes for 15 years, she said. "They're solitary, cautious, and yes, wild. But what I saw out there with the bear and what I've heard about Riley isn't typical. This girl has a gift, a connection I can't fully explain. Riley's behavior shows no aggression, no threat. He's bonded to her in a way that's rare but not impossible. And that bear, she de-escalated a situation that could have ended in bloodshed. That's not recklessness. That's instinct, honed by someone who knew what he was doing, her father." Brooks shot to his feet. "This is absurd," he snapped. "Science doesn't bend for sentimentality. She's a child, not a miracle worker." "Sit down, Mr. Brooks," Judge Cole said, her voice like a whip. He sank back, fuming, as she turned to Emma. "Anything else, Miss Harper?" Emma hesitated, then stepped closer to Riley, kneeling beside him. "Just this," she said softly. "He's my home. And I'm his. Dad taught us that family isn't about where you're from. It's about where you belong. Please, don't take that away." She sat back, her hand resting on Riley's neck, his warmth steadying her shaking fingers. The room held its breath, waiting. Judge Cole stared at them. Emma, Riley, Ellen, Laura, like she was piecing together a story bigger than the law books in front of her. Finally she sighed, a long, heavy sound that echoed in the silence. "We're done here," she said. "I need time to think this over. Court's adjourned until tomorrow morning, 9 sharp." The gavel fell, sharp and final, and the crowd exhaled as one. Emma hugged Riley close, burying her face in his fur. "We tried, didn't we?" she whispered. Ellen squeezed her shoulder, and Laura offered a small, encouraging smile. Whatever came next, Emma knew one thing. She'd given it everything. For Riley. For Jack. For the wild heart they'd all shared. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of day where the sky stretched wide and blue over Grayson County, like it was holding its breath for something big. Inside the courthouse, the air was different, less restless, more expectant. The benches creaked under the weight of the same crowd, their faces a mix of curiosity and hope, but Emma barely noticed. She sat at the front, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Riley sprawled beside her with his head resting on his paws. His amber eyes flicked up to hers, calm as ever, and she managed a small smile. Whatever happened, they'd faced it together. The clock ticked past 9, and the bailiff's call broke the hush. "All rise for the Honorable Margaret Cole." The judge strode in, her robe sweeping the floor, her silver hair catching the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She settled at the bench, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on Emma. "Be seated," she said, her voice firm but quieter than yesterday, like she'd spent the night wrestling with her thoughts. Emma's heart thudded against her ribs, loud enough she was sure Riley could hear it. Aunt Ellen sat beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, steady and warm. Dr. Laura Evans was there too, a few rows back, her notebook closed for once, her eyes locked on the judge. Even Henry Brooks, stiff in his gray suit, seemed less certain, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the table. Judge Cole cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the stillness. "I've heard a lot in this courtroom over the years," she began, her tone measured. "Cases about land, money, promises broken. But this is something else. A girl and a lynx standing here asking me to rewrite the rules. I'll admit, I didn't expect to be thinking about it half the night. A few people chuckled, but Emma held her breath, waiting. The judge leaned forward, her glasses glinting. Mr. Brooks, you're not wrong. The law says wild animals don't belong with people. It's there for a reason: safety, order, common sense. And yesterday when that bear showed up, I thought you'd clinched it. A child shouldn't be anywhere near a situation like that. Brooks nodded, a flicker of triumph crossing his face, but Judge Cole raised a hand. Hold on, she said. I said I thought that. Then I saw what happened. That girl didn't run. She didn't freeze. She walked right up to a wounded animal and turned chaos into calm. I've got rangers telling me they've never seen anything like it. And this lynx, she glanced at Riley, who lifted his head as if on cue. He didn't so much as growl. He stood by her like he knew his place. The room stirred, whispers rippling through the crowd. Judge Cole tapped her pen once, silencing them. Dr. Evans, your testimony didn't hurt either. Science says this shouldn't work, but here we are. And Miss Harper, her eyes softened, just a fraction. You told me a story about your father, about family, about a bond I can't ignore. I don't bend the law lightly, but I'm not blind either. She paused, letting the words settle. Here's my ruling. Riley stays with Emma Harper under a special permit. She'll work with Dr. Evans and the Wildlife Commission, yes, Mr. Brooks, you're still in this, to ensure he's cared for properly and this town stays safe. She'll learn, she'll report, and if anything goes wrong, we revisit this. But for now, I'm calling it what it is, an exception worth making. A gasp swept the room, followed by a burst of applause. Emma's hands flew to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes as the weight lifted, sudden and sweet. Riley nudged her leg with his nose, his purr rumbling low, and she laughed, a bright, shaky sound that cut through the noise. Aunt Ellen pulled her into a hug, her voice thick. You did it, Em. Jack's smiling somewhere, I know it. Brooks slumped in his seat, his jaw tight, but he didn't argue. He gave a curt nod, like he'd accepted defeat but wasn't happy about it. Dr. Laura Evans stood, clapping with the rest, her smile wide and genuine. I'll see you soon, Emma, she called over the din. We've got work to do. Judge Cole banged her gavel, her stern mask slipping just enough to show a hint of a grin. Order, please, we're done here, court's adjourned. The crowd rose, their voices swelling into a hum of excitement, but Emma stayed where she was, her arms around Riley's neck, her face buried in his fur. We're okay, she whispered. We're staying together. The doors opened, and she stepped outside with Riley at her side, the winter sun painting the snow in shades of gold. The air felt lighter, cleaner, like the valley itself was exhaling. She tilted her head back, imagining Jack's face in the clouds, his rough laugh, his steady hands, the way he'd hummed that old tune by the fire. Thanks, Dad, she said softly, her breath a small puff in the cold. A few days later, Emma stood in the yard behind the farmhouse. Riley sprawled in the grass as Dr. Evans scribbled notes. You've got a knack for this, Laura said, watching Riley roll onto his back, lazy and content. We'll start small, tracking local wildlife, learning their patterns. You're part of something bigger now. Emma nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of Jack's jacket. She'd keep learning, keep listening, just like he'd taught her. The valley stretched out before them, wild and wide, and for the first time since he'd gone, it didn't feel so empty. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow, Emma thought about how it all started. A kitten in the river, a man who couldn't walk away, a girl who wouldn't let go. Some bonds, she realized, were stronger than laws, stronger than fear. They were the kind you fought for, the kind that changed everything. She looked at Riley, then up at the sky, and smiled. The wild wasn't just out there. It was in her, in them, stitched into every note of that old song, and together they'd carry it forward, one step at a time.